Hi, this is Christine with Zeidman Development. Today I'd like to walk you through how you can work with Razor's Edge and Importacular in order to upgrade spouses from non-constituent relationships into constituent relationships. So often this is a situation that would happen when one spouse has passed away and the other is still living. And if this is something that you haven't been taking care of on a case-by-case basis, you may have a large number of records that need to be transformed from non-constituent spouses into constituent spouses. So using the individual relationships destination in Importacular, this is something that can be done pretty easily. So to begin, I'm in Query in Razor's Edge, because that's what we're going to do to start so that we can create our data file. So let's open that query and take a quick look. So my criteria here is based off of the premise that I just said. I want to take those spouses off of records where the main constituent or the constituent in Razor's Edge has passed away, but they do have a spouse record, and I want to mark those spouses as constituents. So this is my criteria. Your output needs to be everything that you would like to have to add to that record. So you can see I've added the constituent ID. That is for that deceased spouse, not the living spouse. I've also added the first and last name for the deceased spouse. That is important information that we need to have in order to match these records coming into Razor's Edge, again, from Importacular. Other things you may want to consider adding would be a constituent code if you want to copy a constituent code from the living spouse to from the deceased spouse to the living spouse. As well as contact information. You can see I've added address lines, as well as a cell phone number and an email number. I pulled those off of the spouse account, as well as the spouse name information. Once you have all of your fields in your output, you can go ahead and export it to a CSV, which I have already done. So I'm going to go ahead and close this query, and let's open Importacular and go from there. So when I open Importacular, I'm going to work with the file. There we go. I'm going to open the file that I just created using that export. So I've got that spouse upgrade CSV that I just created from my query. You could also create a CSV or an Excel file using export as well if you needed to. And I'm going to retrieve that data, and let's open the template that I have made to work with my spouse upgrade information. So I've already built this template just to give you an idea of things that are possible. If you haven't built a template before, I definitely encourage you to watch our Getting Started resources and learn how to build a template that way. So you can see that I've labeled my initial constituent mapping as deceased spouse. I was trying to keep this very clear for myself, which information went where. So here I have my deceased spouse. Next, you can see I have a constituent for my living spouse, and I created that constituent on that individual tab. And then the last thing you can see on this tab is I do have a constituent code that I'm adding to that living spouse. So I wanted to make sure that any new records that I created had a constituent code. That's one of my best practices for my database. So I have that mapped here. So let's open this deceased spouse just so you can see what that looks like. And you can see I've mapped the first name, the constituent ID, and the last name. You could add other things here if there was something else that you needed to update, but for what I'm doing right now, I'm really not updating the main constituent. I'm not updating the deceased record. What I want to do is to update the living record so that that person is going to become a complete constituent rather than a non-constituent spouse. So I haven't done much here, but you can, of course, add anything you need to. You do need to address any fields that are required, so I did need to add an addressee and salutation because those are required in my database. So if I didn't want that to update what happens in Razor's Edge, I can always uncheck the boxes here so it won't update anything, but I do have to fill it in because it is required. So let's go ahead and save this mapping. And just to take a quick look, let's see the address. So you can see here on the address, I have linked that preferred address to the living spouse. So I've got that here. I could choose between the deceased spouse and the living spouse. I have linked my address to the living spouse so that I make sure that I have the most up-to-date information there. And I've also linked that email address. finally, you can see on the individual tab, this is where I created the living spouse. So I've gone through and I've added the information that I put in my output with my first name and my gender. And I've added an addressee and salutation. Again, you would want to use the information that is most applicable for your organization, but I've chosen those for mine. And I have filled in all of my required fields. So once you have that set up, you have the mapping here for that individual relationship for a living spouse. You do need to choose a constituent relationship and not a non-constituent. You can't see that because this was already done, but you do have that option when you click on the mapping. Then we take a quick look at our settings, and our area settings for our individual relationships have a few options. And one of them is to convert existing non-constituent relationships to constituent relationships. So that's what we wanted to do from the outset. That's what we said we were going to do, was to upgrade those non-constituent spouses into constituent records. So I'm going to leave that on that setting where it is. And the next thing I want to check is my criteria sets. So criteria sets are how Importacular matches data to Razor's Edge. So we want to make sure that we match those individual relationships exactly. So I'm just going to go ahead and double check and make sure I have something that will allow me to match them based on their names. So I do have my first and last name here as well as the zip code, so that should allow us to match it. If your matches don't come out exact, this is where you would come back and make some changes so that you can ensure that you've matched everyone perfectly. So let's go ahead and save those sets. Let's save and close. And then at this point, we would go ahead and run our import into Razor's Edge. It's going to create those non-constituent spouses into spousal relationships, and they'll be full constituents. And because it's upgrading those non-constituent relationships, you won't see any duplicate relationships, and you will have exactly what you needed in the outset. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great day.